Welcome back. Picture a Sunday morning in Vatican City. The bells of St. Peter's rolling out over a crowd of thousands packed into a square built for exactly this kind of gathering. Tourists shoulder to shoulder with pilgrims who have traveled from Manila and Krakow and Lagos just to stand here for 20 minutes. It looks eternal, doesn't it? Permanent. And yet this entire nation, the smallest sovereign state on earth, covers less ground than most golf courses. And for nearly 60 years in the modern era, it did not officially exist as a country at all. Long before any of these places meant what they mean today, they were almost nothing at all. Monaco began as a fortress rock on the Ligurian coast, seized in 1297 by a man named Francesco Grimaldi, who is said to have disguised himself as a Franciscan monk to slip past the guards. A founding myth so useful the Grimaldi family still tells it. San Marino traces itself further back still, to a stonemason named Marinus who, according to tradition, fled persecution in the early 4th century and built a small community on the slopes of Monte Titano, believing a mountain refuge might let ordinary people live free of interference. Andorra grew out of a much messier arrangement, a strip of Pyrenean valleys whose shepherds and farmers found themselves claimed jointly by a French count and a Spanish bishop in 1278, neither side willing to let the other have it outright. Liechtenstein didn't even choose its own name until 1719, when a wealthy Austrian family bought two small, unremarkable lordships mostly so they could have a seat in the Holy Roman Empire's assembly. Luxembourg started as a single fortified rock purchased in the year 963 by a count named Siegfried, who saw a strategic outcrop where the Alzette and Petrus rivers met and understood its military value long before anyone imagined a country growing from it. None of the people building these first walls and terraces had any idea their small, practical decisions would still matter more than 1,000 years later. By the time each of these places reached its own version of a golden age, size had stopped being a weakness and had become, almost by accident, a kind of camouflage. Luxembourg City's fortress grew so formidable that engineers nicknamed it the Gibraltar of the North, its casemates eventually stretching more than 20 kilometers through solid rock, tunnels wide enough to march soldiers and horses and cannon through in total darkness. Monaco's Prince's Palace, perched on its own rocky promontory above the Mediterranean, expanded century by century from a bare medieval keep into a layered structure of pale stone, red-tiled roofs and formal courtyards, its walls thick enough that you could still find 13th-century masonry hidden beneath 18th-century plasterwork. San Marino raised 3 towers along the ridge of Monte Titano, Guaita, Sesta and Montale, spaced roughly across a jagged limestone spine nearly 750 meters above sea level, each one built and repeatedly rebuilt as watchposts against raiders climbing from the plains below. Liechtenstein's princely family, meanwhile, was busy building one of the great art collections in Europe, filling Vadut's castle with paintings, and even after all these centuries you can still find awkward seams in that castle's walls where different rulers patched, extended, and reinforced it against threats that sometimes came and sometimes never did. Andorra never built grand monuments at all. Its power was written into terraced hillsides and stone-roofed farmhouses, and its enduring monument was really the Periages, the medieval charter of co-sovereignty renewed and argued over again and again for 7 centuries. None of these places was ever finished. They were all still being patched, expanded, and quietly renegotiated right up to the moment modern history came looking for them. Faith and law held these small worlds together in ways that larger nations sometimes lost sight of. In Vatican City, the line between religious devotion and civic government simply doesn't exist, since the Pope has functioned as both spiritual leader and absolute head of state since the Lateran Treaty of 1929 restored the papacy's temporal sovereignty. San Marino's Arengo, an assembly of the heads of every family, met for centuries in the open air to argue over local disputes, a system many historians consider one of the oldest continuously functioning representative governments in the world. Andorra's co-princes, an unusual pairing of the French head of state and the Spanish Bishop of Urgell, still jointly sign the country's laws today, a living fossil of medieval power sharing. In each of these places, layer upon layer of custom, canon law, feudal contract, and modern constitution sit stacked on top of each other like sediment, visible if you know where to look. Down in the streets, ordinary life in these small nations rarely matched the grandeur of their palaces and towers. Monaco's population hovered for centuries around a few thousand fishermen, farmers, and lemon growers who had little in common with the gambling elite who would arrive much later. You would have smelled salted fish drying in the sun and heard the creak of wooden carts on narrow lanes barely wide enough for two people to pass. Liechtenstein's roughly 5,000 residents in the 18th century worked mostly as farmers and weavers, scraping a living from steep alpine slopes, largely unaware that the noble family whose name they carried rarely even visited. San Marino's stonemasons carve graffiti and dates into doorframes that visitors can still trace with a fingertip today, small proof that ordinary people wanted to leave some mark behind. Luxembourg's fortress town swelled with soldiers, blacksmiths, and merchants supplying an army, its narrow medieval streets thick with the smell of forged smoke and stabled horses. None of these were empires. They were villages that happened to survive. Every one of these places had at least one site built for gathering and shared pride rather than daily survival. Monaco's Café de Paris and the Grand Casino Square, completed in the 1860s, transformed a struggling principality into a magnet for European aristocracy almost overnight, its Baroque halls capable of holding hundreds of players and spectators at once beneath painted ceilings and crystal chandeliers. San Marino's public palace, rebuilt in the late 19th century in a deliberately medieval style, became the site of ceremonial ballot counting and torch-lit inaugurations that still draw crowds into its stone piazza. Luxembourg's fortress ramparts, before 19th century treaties forced their demolition, served as informal promenades where the entire town would walk on Sundays, watching soldiers drill on the glacis below. These were the places where community identity crystallized into something you could stand inside. And every one of these tiny nations had its landmark of privilege too. Vaduz Castle in Liechtenstein, still the private residence of the reigning prince, holds room after room of old master paintings by Rubens and Van Dyck, alongside furniture and porcelain collected across 300 years by a family whose wealth vastly outgrew its country's modest fields. Monaco's Prince's Palace filled its state apartments with gilded ceilings, Genoese marble, and frescoes depicting mythological scenes, all wrapped around a private family life largely hidden from the fishermen working the harbor just below the palace walls. Whatever came next, whichever army marched past or treaty rewrote the map, it would not spare the wealthy any more gently than it spared everyone else. The true test for each of these nations arrived at a different moment, but it always looked the same. A much larger power deciding, almost as an afterthought, whether a tiny state was worth the trouble of erasing. In 1793, revolutionary France annexed San Marino's larger neighbors one by one, and only a personal appeal, along with San Marino's careful decision to send grain to starving French troops rather than resist them, is widely believed to have persuaded Napoleon to leave the Republic untouched, reportedly even offering to expand its territory, an offer San Marino wisely declined. Liechtenstein faced its gravest threat not from invasion but from irrelevance. When the Holy Roman Empire dissolved in 1806 and roughly 300 small German states vanished into larger kingdoms within a few years, Liechtenstein survived only because Napoleon, reorganizing Central Europe, happened to place it in his new Confederation of the Rhine as a full sovereign member, a decision made for strategic convenience rather than any belief in the principality's importance. Andorra spent the 20th century largely untouched by both world wars, its rugged mountain terrain and dual French-Spanish protection making occupation more trouble than it was worth, though smugglers moved refugees and gold across its passes throughout the 1940s. Monaco came closest to disappearing during the Second World War, occupied first by Italian and then by German forces between 1943 and 1944, its Jewish residents targeted despite the principality's neutrality, until Allied forces liberated the coast in September 1944. Vatican City's survival was negotiated deliberately. The Lateran Treaty of February 1929, signed between Mussolini's government and Pope Pius XI, created the modern Vatican State specifically to resolve nearly 60 years of dispute after Italian unification had stripped the papacy of its earlier territories in 1870. In each case, the outcome hung on negotiation, geography, or simple bureaucratic convenience rather than military strength, and the people living through these moments could rarely tell whether their home would exist as an independent place by the following year. What followed these crises was rarely dramatic. There was no single collapse, no burial under ash, no centuries of forgetting the way older ruins experienced. Instead, there was slow, careful diplomacy. Treaties renegotiated, borders quietly confirmed, and small governments learning to make themselves useful to larger neighbors rather than threatening to them. Liechtenstein spent much of the later 20th century reinventing itself as a center of banking and light industry, its population growing from a few thousand farmers to nearly 40,000 residents, with one of the highest incomes per person on the planet. Monaco leaned fully into tourism and finance after the war, its skyline filling with high-rise apartments that now make it the most densely populated sovereign state on Earth. Andorra opened its passes to skiers and shoppers, San Marino to tourists tracing its medieval towers, and Luxembourg transformed its old fortress city into a headquarters for European institutions and international banking. Historians studying these nations today find something quietly remarkable in just how ordinary their survival stories are, built not from single dramatic battles but from centuries of careful, unglamorous choices, family alliances, useful neutrality, and the simple fact that absorbing a tiny neighbor was rarely worth the diplomatic cost. It's easy to reduce these places to postage stamp curiosities, jokes about countries smaller than city parks. But behind every border marker is a real decision made by real people generation after generation to keep something small and specific alive rather than let it dissolve into something larger. If you visited each of these nations today, you would find the past sitting comfortably beside the present. Vatican City's St. Peter's Square still fills with pilgrims each week, its colonnade unchanged since Bernini designed it in the 1660s, while the Sistine Chapel just behind it draws millions of visitors annually to stand beneath frescoes finished in 1512. San Marino's three towers on Monte Titano still watch over the Romagna plain, connected by a walkable stone path, and its public palace still hosts the ceremonial installation of new captains regent every 6 months. Monaco's Prince's Palace still conducts a daily changing of the guard at 11:55 each morning, while the old Casino Square now sits surrounded by glass towers and superyachts rather than lemon groves. Liechtenstein's Vaduz Castle remains off-limits to the public as the family's private home, but its art collection tours the world, and the modest capital below now hosts art museums and a national library. Luxembourg's underground casemates, roughly 17 kilometers of surviving tunnels out of the original network, are open for walking tours through cool stone corridors that once sheltered thousands of soldiers. Andorra's medieval Casa de la Vall still stands in Andorra la Vella, its council chamber walls carved with the same 7-lock strongbox, once used to secure the valley's most important documents. Thank you so much for spending this time with me, wandering through 6 countries most maps barely have room to label. If you have a place, tiny or vast, that you think deserves this same kind of walkthrough, drop it in the comments. I genuinely read every suggestion, and I'd love to hear which forgotten corner of the world you want to see brought back to life next. I'll see you in the next one.